was swept off to a bunker the other night because there were a lot of people surrounding the White House. So the Secret Service took him off to some sort of undisclosed underground location. That embarrassed him. He thought that that made him look weak. So he wanted to go out and make a statement yesterday. So there was a group of peaceful protesters across from the White House. He had the police clear them with tear gas and batons and everything, the way the police usually do it, just so he could walk across the street, stand in front of a church, hold up a Bible for about 30 seconds and say something like, "God bless America." And then he went back to the White House. So, this reality TV, comic would-be dictator is just making everything worse. I mean, he's just like talking about crackdown. He wants he wants to send in the army to treat the protesters brutally. To him, they're all terrorists. Like even a peaceful protester is a terrorist, and he's got a long history of this sort of thing. But now, of course, he has a command over a vast destructive structure, and he's urging governors to mobilize their national guards, which are kind of state-controlled little armies, and then also threatening to send in the regular army, which is normally against American law to use the army for domestic law enforcement, but Trump wants to override that and use them anyway. This compounds his vast mismanagement of the COVID epidemic. So we've got 100,000 people who've died. We're probably going to, who knows how many more will die before this all ends. But, he did such a miserable job of responding to it, denying it for months, and the contempt for any kind of medical expertise. Everything is about him. He has not been able to exercise any leadership on how to respond to the health crisis, and now his total reaction to the ongoing riots and uprisings has just been very punitive and hostile one. So it's just he's like a tin pot Hitler, but completely incompetent at that. So I don't know where this is going to go. Historically, we've seen these explosions of protests in the U.S. that may last for a few weeks and then kind of fade, maybe come back and fade. I don't know whether this is going to turn into any kind of sustained or organized political activity, or this will be just another one of these things that will flame out over time. But the level of rage and the depth of the economic and health crisis is so severe that you have to think that maybe this time it really is a little different. There are some concerns that people are showing that back when we had riots in the 1960s, that led to a great backlash, a move to the right among a lot of the American electorate, and also an elite opinion. And there's fear that that will result in Trump's reelection, because by conventional measures, Trump should lose in November with the economy in such terrible shape, with having botched the health crisis so badly, being so personally unpopular, according to the opinion polls. That would normally suggest that he would lose rather badly. But there are people who are thinking that maybe because of this rebellion that will lead to a white backlash and an urge, a longing for an authoritarian crackdown. I don't know. I think things might be different this time. As I said earlier, the uprising of the 1960s came late in a long economic boom, after an expansion of the welfare state, after enormous civil rights gains from the 50s and 60s. And that was fertile ground for some kind of backlash, of resentment of white people who thought that maybe the black folks are just getting a little too much for their comfort. But this time around, everything is pretty much the opposite. We're in the midst of an economic crisis, which itself came after an economic crisis 10 years earlier, and a very poor economic recovery expansion since then. We're seeing certainly cutbacks in the welfare state, lots of austerity, and mass immiseration, really. People are just feeling it extremely difficult to get by, and they were even during what looked like good times. As recently as February, when the unemployment rate was under 4%, there were still people who just really had a hard time making ends meet after 4 decades of neoliberalism and austerity. And now we're in the midst of this crisis where people have no savings, no resources, no welfare state, nothing. Lines a mile long for people to get $20 bags of free food, and just a lot of desperation around. So I've seen elite and popular sympathy for this round of protests like I've never seen before. So something does seem different this time, but it's really hard to see where it will go from here, because Trump is going to try to do everything he can to be authoritarian and perpetuate his time in office. And the Biden. Joe Biden as a candidate is extremely weak and not very popular. He doesn't have much of an agenda to offer as an alternative. We're just this, the fundamental thing to me now seems like the U.S. is a failing empire and a collapsing civilization, and this just all seems to be part of it. I don't know if we can pull ourselves out of it, but right now, it's just it's a grim place to live.
Yeah, do you think Biden has any chance against Trump? And can he handle this? When I look at him on the videos that I watch on YouTube, he doesn't look healthy. How is he?
No, he doesn't look healthy. He's a weak candidate. He keeps saying stupid things. He doesn't have much of an agenda. But I think at this point, there is an exhaustion with Trump. And me, I hate the Democratic Party. I thought I can't vote for Biden. I live in New York State, so it doesn't really matter, because a Democrat will always win in New York State. It's because of our electoral system. My vote really doesn't count for anything. But I just a couple of months ago, I decided I am going to vote for Joe Biden, because this guy has to go. And I think there are an awful lot of people who feel that way, that the debasement, the incompetence, the brutality, the ugliness is just much, much too much to take anymore. And Biden himself is weak, but there is the slight possibility that political pressure and circumstance will lead him to do something like, I don't know, a New Deal, like 1930s-ish New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt ran in 1932 as a fairly conservative Democrat. Nobody really had any idea that he was going to turn out to be the president he turned out to be. So maybe Joe Biden could do that. I don't know. But I think at this point, the major selling point for Joe Biden is just that he's not Trump.
Yes, and if I were an American citizen, I would vote for Biden without thinking a second also. One thing that I noticed when I listened to Trump's speech yesterday was that he made a reference to the Second Amendment rights.
Oh, did he? I didn't catch that.
Yeah, he did. I mean, it's about right to bear arms, isn't it?
Oh, it is, yes. And one of the very frightening things about this environment now is that he has energized, through his rhetoric and his personality and the forces he's mobilized, the worst elements in American society. Armed white militias now feel that they can just parade through the street carrying automatic weapons with no consequence. And there was a video that was circulating on Twitter yesterday of some police in Philadelphia, who were buddying up with the white militias. So there are really, and the police themselves, there's evidence that there are white supremacist gangs all over the police departments of this country. There is a white nationalist motorcycle gang that has a heavy presence in the Minneapolis Police Department. So there is this, this feeling of like this. I really am cautious about the Nazi parallels, but there is this feeling that with these militias, private militias running around, willing to lynch black people and kill protesters, and that with police forces around the country now feeling energized to be brutal. Like I said, they've always been brutal, but they've been more brutal than usual in this round of protests. It is pretty scary that we could get some kind of you know, real serious quasi-Nazi activity. And you know, Trump himself would love to be a Mussolini. Um, and he's got this support of heavily armed white lunatics willing to act as his enforcers. So it's scary, and he's called them into action. He's like calling for rallies, and they respond.
And one thing that also circulating on the Twitter is that we see some bricks that are serviced to the protest areas. Do you have any idea about where they are coming from?
Oh yeah, I saw a tweet about that. I don't really know what that's about. Like they're just delivering like loads of bricks. Protesters can throw them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know where that's coming from. I suspect there are police provocateurs involved in a lot of this stuff. There is some evidence that some of the destruction in Minneapolis was done by either a cop or a cops or some of these white militias. I don't know. No one can really tell what exactly is going on, but it would be consistent with the whole white nationalist agenda and strategy. They want to foment a race war, and that they're just dying for a race war, and they will do anything they can to get one started. And this fits into their agenda, so it's quite possible that they are doing that sort of thing.
One thing I noticed is also that Trump is using religion as a tool to polarize the society. Remember, was it yesterday or today when he went to a church and showed the Bible and
Yeah, you know, that's just the most revolting stuff. I mean, the guy, I'm not religious, I'm not a Christian, but there are things I certainly respect in the Christian tradition. And it pains me to see this violent ignoramus holding up a Bible, which is, you know, at its best is a book of peace and reconciliation and love. To see him using that as an instrument of, he's certainly not alone in this, but, you know, to see him using this as an instrument of hate and fomenting basically some kind of civil war is just revolting. But you know, the right-wing Christians in this country, which are maybe about 30% of the population, uh, they don't care that this guy is completely immoral, sexual harasser, quite possibly a rapist, just, you know, violent, vulgar, horrible character. But they find him politically useful. He's appointing their kinds of judges. He's who will, you know, outlaw abortion, which of course is something they're obsessed with. And they think he's just a very useful political figure for them.
The other day, probably a week or two ago, I attended a teleconference, and one of the participants was Jeffrey Sachs. You know of him, I suppose, right?
Oh yes, yes, yes.
And this fellow accused of being Trump being a psychopath, and not only that, he referred to his administration neo-Nazis, neo-fascists. What's your take on that? I mean, would you call some sort of a new form of fascism can be attributed to these guys?
Well, it's funny that first of all, the transformation of Jeffrey Sachs over the last decade or so has been remarkable. From, you know, Dr. Shock to a fairly left critic for someone, you know, such a mainstream economist as he is. It's been quite amazing to see his evolution. Although, you know, I think he may be going back to his roots. His father was a labor lawyer, and he saw himself in some sense as on the left. So maybe Jeffrey Sachs is going back to his roots. But there really is a fascist flavor to a lot of this. And, you know, we can play games about what fascism means, whether it was something that happened in the 1930s, what exactly we mean. But there's a deep mixture of repressive violence and worship of the leader and the authoritarian figure and, you know, a contempt for intellectuals, It's extremely macho posturing. Yeah, there are a lot of things about it that really smell, whether we call it authoritarian or fascist. I don't know, but yeah, it's not at this point hysterical to use that term. The law professor and historian Samuel Moyn had a piece recently, I think in the London Review of Books, where he was arguing that using the word fascist is not very helpful for getting out of this situation. Like, what do we do? What do we do to respond to it? No, so we say we're in this fascist situation. Okay, we've described it or named it, but what then? I don't know. I think he's got a point, but there is something really scary, not just about what's happening, at the official level from the White House and police departments around the country, but then also what we were talking about earlier, these militias are kind of like the early Hitler years where they Kristallnacht.
Similarities are frightening, I would say.
Well, I guess you got similar things going on in your country, right?
Let me put it differently. You cannot tell the difference, but I better be careful just in case. You are not there yet. Let me put it that way.
Yes,
but it may happen if it goes like this. You still can speak freely. Without expecting some major consequences. You were talking about FDR. Nobody was expecting him to turn out to be what he turned out to be, and said maybe what was his name? Biden.
It's so forgettable.
Which is visual thinking, maybe, but nevertheless, we need that kind of thoughts these days. Do you think there are people around him, given his health, he cannot handle this, would make such major economic changes in the US?
Well, we do have a very, very serious economic crisis, and the Green New Deal, when it was introduced a couple of years ago, which is the idea of massive infrastructure investment to address climate change, but also with an ambitious social welfare redistributionist agenda as well. That seemed fanciful a couple of years ago. And now it seems almost practical as a way of getting out of this deep depression. There are a lot of people on Wall Street and even some mainstream Democrats who think that somehow this virus is magically going to go away in a few months, and the economy will recover rapidly, and this will all be over. I really don't buy that. First of all, I don't see how the virus is going to go away in a few months. But even if it did, there's been so much damage. So many businesses have been destroyed in the last couple of months that it will be very hard for anybody to reopen. So people won't have any jobs to go back to. Businesses won't exist anymore. Especially, I think restaurants have just been destroyed. Hotels, motels have been destroyed. Lots of smaller service businesses, retailers, all really in desperate shape, and probably won't be able to survive being closed for a couple of months. So it could take some really bold action to turn things around, and something on the model of that kind of New Deal, I think, would be important. Now, Biden is surrounded by a mix of people. His advisors come from kind of Wall Street wing of the Democratic Party. He's getting economic advice from the likes of Larry Summers. But he also has appointed these advisory committees, about a third of which come out of the Bernie Sanders campaign.
Is that correct?
There is this substantial, and a couple of his I actually know a couple of his economic advisors from the Sanders wing. And also some of the others. One of his education advisors is a friend of mine. So I met her back during the anti-globalization movement in the late 90s, early 2000s.
What happened to
but now she's a social democrat. But there's this there is still a substantial presence in the Democratic Party of that Sanders wing which is also making gains at the lower levels of government, like at local government races, state legislatures, that sort of thing. So he does have to contend with those pressures to his left, which is not something any previous Democratic president has had to do for decades, really. I mean, in the 60s, yes. In the 30s, yes, but certainly not any time in recent decades. So there, I think he needs not only that kind of thinking for just electoral support, but also I think they need the intellectual input, because the mainstream of the Democratic Party is completely bereft of ideas. I mean, they're intellectually, politically bankrupt, and they're just trying. I think they wanted to, the whole idea was Trump is all our problem. Let's just get back to things before Trump and everything will be okay. Now, obviously, was never true in the first place, but now it's especially not true. I mean, everything is so broken now; it's going to be impossible to try to reassemble the way things were in the summer of 2016 before Trump was elected. And certainly, it's not even going to be hard even to go back to February 2020 before all the COVID stuff hit. So yeah, things are really systemically broken, and the circumstances might force someone like Biden to be much more ambitious and aggressive than he would be on his own.
You keep referring to 2016, summer of 2016. I believe that's when Trump was elected. Do you think this was a turning point for the U.S.? Why are you so much emphasizing that year? Because
I'm just saying that Trump was elected in November 2016, and it's hard to balance this sort of thing out, the analysis and critique out, because things have always been pretty terrible in this country. Brutal, extremely unequal, lots of poverty, lots of violence, lots of deep racism, geographic divisions, all these. It's been and I think we're on a long trajectory of imperial decay too. So I mean, it's not that Trump created these things, but I think he's made them worse.
Yes.
So it's hard for when you say that. Sometimes people on the left will say, "Oh, but everything was the same before." No, things weren't the same before. But then you also have like mainstream Democrats who think everything was pretty much okay before Trump. If we just get rid of him, we'd go back to normal. That's not true either. So I think, the way I say it in a sentence is that things were bad before Trump, but he's just made them worse. And that's especially terrible now because we're in the midst of all these crises when we need some sort of imaginative and ambitious political response. Yeah. And we're certainly not getting it from him. We're getting nothing but from him but destructiveness. And the whole Republican Party now is kind of attached to a wing of the capitalist class, these private equity titans and people like this, who don't really build anything. They're just smash and grab people. And Trump himself did this when he was in business. You load companies up with debt, take all the money out, and then leave them to collapse. That's the private equity model. That's the Trump model of how he did business when he was running casinos. There's that whole ethic pervades the Republican Party now, and that's a very, very serious problem. I mean, this is the rot of the American elite is a very big part of the story of what's happening to this country. These are people with no sense of the future. All they want to do is get as much money as they can now. And you can see them now, this group, the private equity people circling over the, like vultures, over the corpses of so many businesses, or they're waiting to buy up houses that people are going to get taken away from them. They did that in 2000, after the 2008 crisis. And I think they're poised to do that again. Just pick over the bones and get richer, while everyone else is wearing rags.
However, there is a problem, right? They have to find people to rent the properties that they buy for cheap. How is that going?
Yeah, they will have that problem. They haven't figured that one out yet. But I guess they're hoping that things will recover eventually. But all they want to do is pick up assets on the cheap. They're not really thinking about anything, any kind of long-term strategy of recovery.
What happened to this plan to lend to the small and medium size enterprises thing?
Well, the whole bailout, they spent, was it $2 trillion? That's just appropriated by Congress. And then the Federal Reserve has, last I looked, bought up about $4.5 trillion in assets. But almost all of that has gone to very big businesses. The program to assist small business has been woefully underfunded and really badly managed, and big businesses have actually managed to get their hands on a lot of the money. So all these small business people who are desperate for assistance have just haven't been able to get any. I mean, the Financial Times had an article about the Swiss version of this program, which involved sending in a one-page application, and then a half an hour later, the money was in the bank. In the U.S., the small business bailout scheme has been administered through banks, not through the government.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a nightmare. I have a friend who owns owned now several restaurants in Brooklyn, and she tried to get assistance under this program. She went into the Bank of America, with whom she'd had a longstanding relationship. She had a business checking account there. She'd had a line of credit there. But they wouldn't give her the money because she didn't have a credit card with the Bank of America. So it's just like, they're just being very arbitrary. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York did there's also an NBER paper about this as well, looked at the early distribution of funds under this plan. And they've gone mostly to larger businesses and to regions that have least been affected by the disease or the economic collapse. So the regions that most badly need it, the sectors that most badly need it, are not getting the money, and those who don't need it so much are getting the money. It's just been badly designed and badly administered from the first, and it's not doing anything like what it was supposed to have done.
I have a technical question, if you paid any attention to that. One thing that I noticed is that this commercial and industrial loans in the US are spiking unbelievably. I mean, there's a huge jump, about 600 billion or so. And it appears that it's the banks that are lending the money. Are they doing through the Fed, or are they, I mean,
Actually, I don't really know what that's about. That'd be interesting to look into. I have no idea.
Yeah, but
I wonder if that reflects some of this the small business bailout program, which would be administered through banks, or whether it is.
I doubt that
larger businesses.
Commercial and industrial loans are usually for the larger businesses.
Yeah, I don't know what that's about.
Yeah, they're very interesting. Well, one thing that I wanted to ask you while you were talking about the left thing around Biden was what happened to the modern monetary theory fellows who were supporting Bernie, and then are they also among the advisors? Or
I'm sorry to say, Stephanie Kelton is also on the advisory committee. So she's now one of Biden's economic advisors. I can't imagine. She's been a Sanders advisor in the past, and he never paid much attention to her. But she somehow managed to insert herself everywhere.
Okay, so those fellows are also among the advisors of Biden. Anything else that you would like to tell us about what's going on?
It's just I just conclude by saying it's just all very, very confusing. I mean, it's been a crazy year, and I just don't really understand what's happening or what's going to happen. It's just I think the level of psychological stress in the population too, from the anxiety of lockdown and the disease. People are really, really suffering, and a lot of people have been suffering in pretty isolated ways because just normal social ties have been so disrupted. So there's really a pretty hellish period here in the land of the free.
One last thing that I want to mention is the following that I noticed yesterday or the day before. First Trump, then Pompeo attacked China in the media, declaring China to be the enemy of the Western values and all that. Is it something that was caused by the panic that comes from these protests? Or, they were presumably trying to mend the ties with China, and the trade tension was going down and all that. And suddenly, China became the enemy of the not only the U.S. but also the Western civilization. What's your take on this?
Well, the turn against China started under the Obama administration. Hillary Clinton, in particular, had a pretty anti-Chinese foreign policy. She called it the pivot to Asia, she recounts in her memoir of her time as Secretary of State, meeting with a Chinese diplomat who said, "Why don't you just pivot your way out of here?" They were really annoyed with her. So it does go back to that. They're concerned about, I don't know, expansionist efforts by China in the South China Sea and all these sorts of things. But it's, of course, as many other things, it's accelerated and intensified under Trump. In no small part because he really is a racist who has a really virulent distaste for Chinese people. He just he can't. He hates Asians and Latinos with a passion, it's weird. He's not been as anti-black as a lot of right-wing Republicans are, but he's really anti-Asian, anti-Latino, So, but of course, there's a real rivalry going on. I think that a lot of people in the U.S. elite think of China as a rising rival power, and they want to. They don't like the idea of surrendering the #1 status in the world, and they feel that China is a threat to that. So, there's this kind of rational imperial core to it, but there is a intense emotional component to it as well, coming out of Trump and the people around him who just hate Chinese. They've made this part of their reelection strategy. That they want to run against China. They want to portray Biden as soft on China, and they're hoping that they can use all this kind of yellow peril arguments, which have deep roots in American history, as a way of getting reelected. If we just blame everything on China, and of course, Trump wants to blame the coronavirus on China as well. So for Trump, problems always come from somewhere else. He's never responsible for anything, and China is a convenient container or receptacle for that. All his problems come from China, and they want to push it. And Pompeo is a lunatic Christian fundamentalist who believes that we're entering the end times, and a lot of these people really want to provoke a war. This is the kind of people who are running this country now: lunatic Christians and virulent racists.
And what would be, in your opinion, the probability of starting a war for them with China on the other side?
I don't know. It seems suicidal and insane to me to start a war with China, but Trump often talks more aggressively than he acts. For somebody who talks as aggressively foreign policies he's just launched a few cruise missiles, but I don't think he's launched as many as Obama did. Mm-hmm. He hasn't invaded Iraq like George W. Bush did. But these things take on a life of their own. So this increasing tension with China it's scary. That's the last thing we need. To have an economic crisis, a health crisis, and provoking all these warlike acts with China. It just makes no damn sense. But this is what it's like to live. Well, you're not living here, but I am. What it's like to live in an empire in a crisis of decline.
Yeah. One last thing that I would like to mention is the following. I mentioned this to you before the audience entered the meeting. This was my son's opinion. As I told you, he's an American citizen, following the American politics closely, a Bernie supporter, if you like. And I mentioned this to you also before we started. He claimed that even if Trump loses the elections in September, he might refuse to step down and possibly they can trigger if he does that some sort of a civil war in the U.S. What is your take on this? How likely do you think such a scenario would be?
Well, my rational mind said it's very, very unlikely, but enough crazy things have happened that I wouldn't say it couldn't happen. I think, I don't know, Trump has busted up so many of the norms of American life that I don't know whether he could bust this one up too. But the idea of holding elections on time, there's never been a postponed election, presidential election in the history of the country, uh, despite war or whatever. I would think that I would hope that the Secret Service would just haul his hideous corpus out of the White House should he refuse to leave. But you never know. And then if that happened, or if he lost and claimed that he was cheated, and vacated the office, but it's quite possible to imagine him like whipping up a frenzy of rebellion, and his armed lunatic supporters in their militias would get violent. That's always a really live possibility. So that sort of thing is scary. So, even if he did vacate office, that doesn't mean that we've heard the last of Trump, or that he couldn't cause trouble out of office, because he has certainly quite an audience of very very loyal supporters, and they could and they have a lot of weapons, so it could get very ugly.
And what's scary is that Trump is not alone. There are many leaders in many countries like him.
Well, there's certainly of them, and this is how neoliberalism ends, in this sort of tragic comedy of authoritarianism.
Yeah. Anyway, I guess at this point, I better thank you for sharing your time and knowledge with us regarding what's going on in the US, and your analysis of the events, and your expectations about the future. And hopefully we will have you again as things.
All right.
Hopefully.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. Anytime. Okay.
Thank you, Doug.
Bye. Bye.